Welcome to today's presentation. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you happen to be watching this. Um, if you weren't in class, I hope this is a little bit helpful. This, as the title slide says, is going to be a hodgepodge. It's just going to be a mess. I'm going to try to do 3 or 4 things as we go through the 3 or 4 essays of Green's that we've been talking about, or podcast texts, whatever you want to call them. And so I apologize if I jump around a lot more than usual. I apologize if this seems more disjointed than usual. I'm going to do my best to cover all of the basics as we go through this thing. 2 goals. I want to look at the text ideas presented in some of Green's essays, and I want to discuss some writing tips based on Green's writing. And to put it just a little bit of a different way, I think that all writing goals have 2 points: style and substance. All right. And so we're going to look at sometimes the substance of what he does, sometimes the style of what he does. You're going to get a lot of opinions about what I think is working, what I think is working, and you're going to get the viewpoints of a 64-year-old man as opposed to your viewpoints as a 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old student. So this might be helpful at that way too, just to see how different people can view the same piece of writing. I'm going to structure the style element into do's and don'ts. I have quotations on the slides. I have comments on some of the slides. I'm going to make some comments here that may not necessarily appear on the slides, but we're just going to look at some things that I consider do's. We're going to talk about the structure and the substance of what he writes in those do's, as well as in the don'ts. And sometimes in the do's, I'm going to say, oh, by the way, this is really terrible. And sometimes in the don'ts, I'm going to say, oh, by the way, this is really good. As I said, this is going to jump around a bit. Fair warning. In the summary, work to avoid using I. And in the response, work to avoid using I believe, I think, in my humble opinion, all of those things. I believe that using the word I leads to some lazy wordiness. I think, I believe, I hope, I have shown that. All of those phrasings don't need to be there, they're just padded words. The reader should be able to infer your opinions. If you have sweat the essay, the way we talked about in the last presentation a couple days ago, you should be able to, the reader should be able to infer. And remember that the summary viewpoint should be objective. So you are a disinterested observer writing from the outside. That is the only way to be objective. If you are part and parcel of the situation, it's impossible to be objective. Okay? And so work to avoid using I, especially in the summary. I would argue that you should work to avoid using I in the response as well, but especially in the summary, work to avoid using I. Have warrants and explanations. If you look at the yellow thing, I think the idea of, I confess I find it overwhelmingly hopeful. That seems to be the thesis. He gives some data, he gives some concrete details. 4 kids and a dog named Robot discovered a cave. 2 teenagers devoted themselves to the cave protection. When humans became a danger, we agreed to stop going. That's data. But that doesn't speak for itself. Why does that thing make it hopeful? It's hopeful because we could have done a bunch of terrible stuff, graffitied over the paintings. We could have kept visiting them until black mold ate them away entirely. We didn't. We sealed them off. It's hopeful because we did the right thing when we easily could have done the wrong thing. Warrants an explanation. Stylistically, I find this thing works really well. This, I think, is a model for all of you to try to follow. I also want to talk here about embracing some contradictions. If you look at the photo, you see a duckbill platypus, one of my favorite creatures of all time. And there is some really weird contradictory stuff here. The cave paintings are real. The history he presents is real, and yet humans have made fake cave art to save the real cave art. And we're in the middle of a human centered planet, and yet we're faking things on cave walls, excuse me. And that just seems to me to be absurd. And sometimes when you're writing, as long as you can accept the fact that you're going to be surprised, and I'm going to come to that in a future slide, when you're reading Green, work to accept the absurdities. Humans are absurd creatures, and so work to accept the absurdities of human life. And I think stylistically and structurally and as a part of the substance, it's one of the great things that Green does is he points out a lot of absurdities that we go here. Fake cave art to save real cave art seems like a egg-laying mammal to me. Make connections to other works. Green talks about the internet and he gives the statement, I don't know if it's my age or the fact that the internet is no longer plugged into the wall and now travels with me everywhere I go, but I find myself thinking of that Wordsworth poem that begins, the world is too much with us, late and soon. This happens to be one of my favorite poems. I taught it a lot of times when I was teaching high school English literature. And I think it's just important to make connections to other works. I think our brains work well when we make connections. And so use song lyrics, use quotations from well known bits of literature or references to popular television shows or movies as you respond. Do all of that. That's fine. Just make sure you give the reader enough context to understand the quotation and to understand why it works and why it's important. I think that that's just huge. Use the quotations, use the pop culture references, have a clear thesis and follow it throughout. Okay? Green's thesis, it seems to me, is that in the Anthropocene, there are no disinterested observers, there are only participants. And he follows this throughout, and I could have put the duckbill platypus here as well. Accept the paradoxes, accept the contradictions, accept all of that. One of the great oddities of the Anthropocene, we are so much the dominant creatures on this side of the planet that we essentially decide which species live and which die. But as an individual, I don't feel that power. I can't decide whether a species lives or dies. I can't even get my kids to eat breakfast. In the daily grind of a human life, there's a lawn to mow, soccer practices to drive to, a mortgage to pay. Green's thesis that we are participants, and yet, as participants of being the dominant creatures on the planet, he gets to the core that I think all of us feel. You know, you want Collis to assign less homework. You probably want Collis to take a day off and have no daily writing. You want all of this stuff to happen and you don't have tons of control over it. Okay? I want tons of stuff to happen. I don't have much control over it. It's supposed to be a human centered era. It's supposed to be a human centered planet. I'm allegedly a human being. And yet, all of these mundane things keep me from appreciating all of the beauty and perhaps all of the power of being human. Green, I think, does a great job of having a clear thesis and following it throughout all of those essays. There's that thread seems to run through. We are participants. And at some points, he gets to the core of human existence. We are supposed to be powerful. We are supposed to be wonderful creatures created in God's image. And yet, most of the day, most of the time, every day is a daily grind. You show up at class at 2, you pray Collis is interesting, you pray you can get through class and go take a nap. It's a daily grind, and yet there's this idea that we are the dominant creatures on the planet. Feel free to attack Green's conclusions. I happen to like Canada geese. I happen to like seeing them fly over. I understand that perhaps there are some symbolic things that Green does a good job of. But if you're going to accept that the goose isn't to blame, why give the Canada goose only 2 stars? Why? I think that anytime you go through and look at what he's writing, he's got a lot of facts, he's got a lot of examples. Why is this conclusion correct? Why is this conclusion incorrect? Either one of those is fine. You can support them as well. Is it a supportable thing to give it 2 stars just based on the symbolic nature of it? Perhaps. I think that the geese flying in V formation above was beautiful enough to warrant 3.5 stars, even if it's a bad symbol. Okay. Actually, I think it's higher than that, but we'll let that slide for now. I mentioned earlier I was going to talk about being surprised. I think it's always important that when you write, when you sit down to write, you should have a plan. But as you're writing and writing and writing, and as you're doing the cubing or you're doing whatever free writing exercises you want to, pre-writing exercises you want to do, as you're free writing, as you're looping, all of those things we talked about, you might come to the conclusion that I don't know what the heck's going on. And even if we think we have the answer, we might have forgotten how we got there or why the answer matters. That's part of the Douglas Adams Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The answer to the great question of life, the universe, and everything is 42. But nobody really knows why. And I think, again, going back to the grind, one of the things I really like about Green is there's a certain honesty and openness about his writing. We're living in the middle of history. We just hopefully are coming to the end of the pandemic era, and we're moving into an endemic. We're moving into beyond all of this. But I'm not sure any of us really figured out what the thing means. I'm not sure we have any idea of what the internet means. And we're just trying to struggle through. And Green does a good job of writing that way. And I think as you're writing, as you're responding, it's important to be honest. It's important to recognize your limitations as a human being. It's important, I think, to write to be surprised. It's fine to kind of come to a conclusion that you didn't expect when you started. And again, I'll go to Casablanca. He knew gambling was going on, but he could fake being shocked. And if you can fake being shocked as you're writing your essays and do it well, I'm fine with that too. Another thing Green does is he challenges prevailing orthodoxy. Maybe it's just my cynicism as a baseball fan. Maybe it's just the idea that stats shouldn't matter for everything. But I've been hearing a lot about how, we're far more advanced than we were 50 years ago, that athletes are far better than they were 50 years ago, that humanity has progressed beyond what it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago, that we would never think of enslaving human beings again. And I'm Just a little cynical about that. And I think that we are humans just like the ancient Greeks were humans, just like everybody throughout history, recorded history, has been human. And we are as human as they are as human as we are. And I think that that prevailing orthodoxy is important. And if it takes handprints on a cave wall to get us to think that, I think that that's awesome. And Green, I think, ever so often takes us down a path where he reminds us that perhaps the prevailing orthodoxy, that somehow we are far superior to the people who were living in those caves, that somehow we are far superior to the ancient Greeks who were fighting with bronze weapons, that we are far superior to the people who lived in the medieval era, that we are far superior to the people who lived in Shakespeare's time, that we are far superior to the people who lived in the early 1800s, is perhaps wrong. Humans of the past are as human as we are. We're as human as they are. We're subject to the same temptations, the same foibles, the same mistakes that they made. We're subject to the same prejudices and biases. I think challenging prevailing orthodoxy is good. I think Green does a great job of doing that. We're coming back to this because stylistically, I think there's a mistake here. But substantively, I think this was an awesome, awesome uh, observation. Let's take a look at the don'ts. Again, a lot of these are stylistic um, more than they are substantive, but let's see what happens. Number one, know your audience. This is something that bugs me more than I think it bugs any other professor in the English department, something that it bugs me more than it bugged all of my colleagues when I was teaching high school. It just bugs me. Don't string rhetorical sentences or questions together. The rhetorical question should provoke focused thought, and a series of questions will distract from that focus. Don't. Just don't string them all together. Pick one. Make sure it's the best question you've got. Get the focus on your reader to come to that answer and that answer only and move on. And this is especially true because you're writing a short paper, 3 pages. You don't have time to focus on life, the universe, and everything. You get to focus on one. All right? You get to focus on one, and everything is not the one. Don't forget to cite for specific stats. Geese also enjoy rural fields near rivers and lakes. You don't need a stat for that. Everybody knows that. The ratio of city geese to country geese in the United States is quite similar to the human ratio. I don't know if that's common knowledge, but there aren't any numbers. It might just be an observation. He would have to develop that in the next sentence. However, once you get to the stat, 80% of American humans are in or near urban areas. That might be common knowledge. We've heard a lot about the urban rural divide politically. We've heard, we know that California has way more people than South Dakota. We know that if you take the top 5 or 10 states in population, they basically equal the other 40. So that might be okay. But when we get to, for Canada geese, it's about 75%. I need a citation. I need a stat for that. There are common knowledge exceptions. Okay? The 80% of American humans live in or near urban areas. That might fit the common knowledge exception. I don't know anybody who thinks about Canada geese enough to say that this 75% fits it. Green has an editor. He probably has a stat buried someplace in the back of the book. You don't have that luxury. We're using the MLA style guide. Cite the site, give the citation, and we'll go from there. I talked about the idea that you should, make connections to popular music, to poems, to literature, to whatever. But do you know who Wordsworth is? Do you know the title of the poem? Can you give the next line? The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. Can make sure you provide enough details to allow the reader to make the connection? In this case, the line is pretty good. The internet is too much with us. The world is too much with us. Okay? But I do think that perhaps the effect, late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. I mean, let's face it, the internet is, still a lot of whatever the latest TikTok meme is and a lot of Amazon shopping. That part would tie in just as well. It's maybe not a point that Green makes, but it's something readers might want to think about. And don't go off on tangents. Again, I use this quotation in the Do's. I think that the conclusion that humans of the past were as human as we are, I think that's awesome. I think the idea of handprints and reminding us that life may have been different and that there's amputations from frostbite were common, and you get to see these other hand stencils. But then all of a sudden, we're jumping to the number of people who died, the number of people who did not live to the age of 5. We're jumping in a whole new era. If this is about handprints and how handprints show life was different and how handprints show life was harder, focus on the handprints. And then do the flip, do the contrast, show that humans of the past are as human as we are. But don't go off on tangents. Don't go off on the other stats. If you need a separate paragraph because that's important, then make it a separate paragraph. I believe this is the last slide. We're going to wrap it up here. Hope to see you in the next class. And thank you. I hope this didn't jump around too much. I hope I didn't go off on the tangents I accused Green of going off on. Have a good day. Hope to see you in class.